Hello, political geographers. It's Dr. Devine here. Welcome to the first part of the lecture titled War on Drugs. I hope that you have all had a chance to look at the track site and familiarize yourself with a couple of things that I asked you to do in the Welcome Back online transition video. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now that I've said hello. I hope you're saying hello too. I hope you're all well. Let's go ahead and dig into it. And we're still sort of figuring things out here, so I want to take a minute and show you what we have in tracks in case you have not taken a look, and just to sort of give you another overview here. Okay, so here we are on our track site. You can still see me up in the upper right hand corner. That's great. We're political geography. I'm gonna make sure that my view looks like yours. Of course, as a professor, I have different options, but this is what your option menu looks like. And you're gonna go to syllabus. Here is the online overview chart. Remember that that is very useful in summarizing all of the different ways that you're learning in this course, and also the ways that you're being evaluated in this course. Okay, so if you have a question about how do I find this information, where is the Zoom link, etc., I bet you it's on this overview chart. If it's not on the overview chart, it is likely to be on the syllabus. So please read the chart and the syllabus. And excuse me. Also, I sent you an email and you have posted on announcements, but then here sort of in our sequence of course work, you have a link here to my YouTube channel that has the spot that I'm uploading all of the lectures. So if you haven't watched this video, please do so. It's 13 minutes. I walk through very slowly, not very slowly, but slowly, the syllabus in more detail. So watch that if you haven't done it. And then, of course, just to remind you that Forums has a revision as well. Here you can post questions on forums about your concerns or questions about the online transition. Thanks, June, for asking those questions. We also have a location here for each lecture, like today's lecture, where you can post questions. And you can see here that June has made a post. And so a great way for you to remember, this is sort of your student view. You can reply and write something in response to her, or you could even go back to the discussion board and start a new conversation. Post your own question or comment. This is going to be a way that we can make our class dynamic and interactive. So please, I encourage you to do those things. All right, so I'm figuring out YouTube channels, and it seems to me that the easiest thing is going to be to have the lectures posted via a link, so you can stream this video rather than having to download it. Here you can see I have a downloadable video for the online introduction. So I'm going to try to do both of these, but most certainly I think this YouTube link is going to be the easiest option. So if you have any feedback for me on that, the easiest way to get a video for you to get this lecture, that would be a great thing to write here in Forums as one of your comments and feedback about the online transition. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's lecture. Let's go back to resources, just like you did when we were meeting in person for the class. You're going to go to resources, and you're going to go to the week. that we're on, and that's week 10, the drug wars. On Monday, here we are. You're going to find that I have posted the PowerPoint lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how you as students can download the lecture and have it open when I give the lecture myself. And you could even do what I've done and put some notes here in the notes section. Okay. So here we go, students. Let's jump into the lecture. Let me move this down here and get it out of the way. Hopefully this won't be too difficult for you to look at here. Okay, so the title of this lecture is the U.S. War on Drugs. And of course, as you just saw under that resources file, there were 3 readings or 3 assigned readings for today. 2 are found online. Actually, they're all found online. But in addition to drug war statistics, which we'll look at in a minute, there's a basic overview page of drug war history, and I'm drawing on a lot of that here in this lecture. But then there is really importantly the Global Commission on Drug Policy's 2011 report, War on Drugs. So I would like you to read this. This is a really informative document, and it's going to be even more important as we move forward to going online that you engage with the readings. Okay. All right. So the U.S. war on drugs. I like this political cartoon. I think it really encaptures the situation that Latin America finds itself in today. And just as we're getting started, this reminds me that there are 2 terms that you want to have very clear, okay? I'm going to be referring to the U.S. war on drugs as a set of policies based on military interdiction, which is using police force to stop and seize the flow of illicit drugs, illegal drugs into the United States. The way that the United States has tried to deal with the problem of drugs, the violence of drugs, the addiction that's associated with drugs, is to spend trillions of dollars, $3 trillion to be exact, has been spent by the US government fighting the war on drugs. And even that language, fighting the war, right? This is a militarized, this is combat. And what's happened is this approach of fighting the problem of drugs as a war against drug trafficking organizations has produced a lot of violence, particularly in Latin America, which is the transit corridor, the production and transit corridor for one of the most notorious illicit drugs, cocaine. And in my own research, I spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, just double checking. My own research, I do a lot of work thinking about how cocaine moves through Central America, the region of my specialization, and what impact the flow of drugs, the transit of cocaine in particular, has on environments and societies. So this lecture and really the next couple of weeks, we're getting into where my research and my teaching overlap. So I have a lot of expertise on these issues. If you're interested in doing some additional research or looking for topics for honors thesis or even master's projects, please keep me in mind as somebody who's working on these issues if they interest you as well. Okay, so enough of that. Let's get started, if I can here. All right, so in 1973, we mark the beginning of the US-led war on drugs, okay? So Richard Nixon in 1970, actually 1971, he declares the war on drugs. And that's when that militarized language of war and fighting becomes more popular. It becomes a discourse. The war on drugs is a discourse, isn't it? All of the ways of talking about and representing a phenomenon, which of course would include that map, or that political cartoon that I opened with. That's part of the discourse. So anyway, what Nixon did in the early 1970s was that he revised the penal code in the United States to really make the legal system a way to go after not only drug traffickers, but small-scale drug users. So in the early 70s, drug consumption, recreational drug consumption, and drug addiction became criminalized. And this quote really captures it here. He said, "I shall propose a revision of the entire federal criminal code, which will give us tougher penalties against drugs." So in 1971, Nixon declares the war on drugs, and in 73, the DEA is established. And early in the history of the war on drugs, this criminalization of small-scale possession and consumption, even of drugs like marijuana, right? It was unpopular. And indeed, Carter, President Jimmy Carter, when he ran successfully for president in the United States in the mid-1970s, 76, he actually had decriminalization of marijuana as part of his presidential platform. And when he was elected, in 12 states where small-scale marijuana possession had been criminalized, those laws were decriminalized. What does that mean? Well, it means not that marijuana is legal, but that if you have a small amount defined by law, and the police apprehend you, that you're not necessarily going to jail, but you might be put on probation, you might be referred to drug addiction services, and might, in today, decriminalization also entails drug deferment court. The idea that rather than going to jail, you can get treatment and education about drugs. So anyway, these decriminalization policies is an important term, decriminalization. So that's why I took a moment to explain that to you. So, you know, the war on drugs early on is not popular by some. Carter runs on a platform of decriminalization. And ultimately, when Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, in the 1980s, he reinvigorates the US-led war on drugs. And so it's with really the election of Ronald Reagan that we see an escalation of the war on drugs, harsher penalties being enacted. And indeed, First Lady Nancy Reagan, one of her first and most important campaigns as First Lady was the Just Say No to Drugs campaign. So this was an approach of complete prohibition, complete abstinence from drugs. All drugs were bad, just say no. Very little education about the different types of drugs or how to deal with addiction and use drugs safely. This is really sort of the broad overview of this history of the war on drugs. And it's also important before we move on to say that you have to understand what motivated Nixon to declare a war on drugs in the first place. It was an intense time in our country's history, the 1960s. The Vietnam War has been going on, and the Vietnam War also brought not only social unrest and the counterculture and the hippie counterculture, which was leading the protests, who were consuming marijuana and LSD and other drugs. Vietnam also brought opioids to the United States, because remember the politics of mobility. Whenever you have flow in one place, you're going to have connections, other types of commodities and relations of ideas and trade. And so, be thinking again relationally about your geographies. The Vietnam War created not only military links, not only migration links, but also opened up mobility for illicit drugs to be brought back to and from Southeast Asia. So we have among not only the US society in general an uptick in the use of drugs and counterculture, but also, unfortunately, many of the American GIs who came back from Vietnam also came back with serious health issues and addiction issues to drugs as well. So it was really the combination of all of these dynamics that led Nixon in '71 to declare war on drugs. Okay. So I was just saying that Reagan reinvigorates the war on drugs, and one of the key ways that he did that was by passing in 1986 the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. I'm going to see if I can do this. Here we go. Yay. Okay, this is really important here. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1987. Okay, let's see. Screen save. We'll see here. Let's do that. No, I can't. All right, folks. I'm going to take a break here in a minute and I'll figure that out. But okay, so let's continue. So this is what was contained in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. Okay. Oh, actually the circles in the box work just perfectly for me. Okay. So what this Anti-Drug Abuse Act did, and if we were in class, I would be quizzing some of you on what it contained. But basically what it did was that, as it says here, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was a law of the war on drugs passed by the US Congress that changed a system of federal supervised release from a rehabilitative system to a punitive system. So what does that mean? From a rehabilitative system to a punitive system, it means precisely the criminalization of drug possession and drug addiction. Rather than rehabilitating drug addicts and treating them as patients, the punitive system treats them as criminals and sends them, of course, to courts and possibly jail, and punishes them for the consumption, possession of drugs. Okay, so that's really important. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act reinvigorates and, well, basically changes this from a rehabilitative system to a punitive system, okay? The 1986 Act also prohibited controlled substance analogs. What is a controlled substance analog? You're exactly right. Methadone is an example of a controlled substance analog. What is methadone? Just kidding, I wish you were here with me. But methadone is actually a prescription that doctors can provide their patients who are addicted to heroin. And basically, it is part of a treatment supervised by a doctor that enables heroin addicts to use methadone as a substitute or an analog for heroin, which controls the quantity of the drug, because of course there are many overdoses when people are doing heroin. They don't know how strong it is, or forbid that, you know, fentanyl be laced in the heroin, which is what often kills people. They can then also receive other medical treatment and basically try to reduce the amount of methadone. They don't go through withdrawals. Supposedly, I think proven, not supposedly, but I don't have the stats on it. As I understand, with treatment with methadone, people are more successful in recovering from heroin addiction. So what the 86 Act did was prohibit the use of things like methadone to help treat patients. And I also know that similar sort of substances, analog substances exist for other drugs like Oxycontin and which actually, yeah. But there are other examples like that. Okay, So also interestingly, the bill enacted new mandatory minimum sentences for drugs, including marijuana. Okay, so mandatory minimum sentences. Judges no longer had any discretion, or prosecuting attorneys no longer, it would be better said, would have no discretion with this mandatory minimum. And what was really controversial about this law gets us back to cocaine, and it was this part here that I have highlighted. The act mandated a minimum sentence of 5 years without parole for the possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, while it mandated the same possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine. This 100 to 1 disparity was reduced to 18 to 1 when crack was increased to 28 grams by the Fair Sentencing Act under Obama. So, okay, let's break this down. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, first, to understand why this discrepancy was seen as so unfair, was that first you have to understand the relationship between cocaine and crack as substances. Okay, so to make a long story short, crack is actually made from cocaine. There, I think, is just some other substances like, I think, baking soda, and it's smoked versus snorted. But when you look sort of at the chemistry and the makeup of crack versus cocaine, they're essentially the same. They're the same, okay? There are small differences. It might be, you know, I don't want to get into the weeds here, especially with posting this information online, because at least we misinform people. But basically, crack is made out of cocaine. Chemically, they are so similar, but socially, they're very different. Cocaine is very, very expensive. And so when poor folks make crack out of cocaine to make it last longer, to make it a little bit stronger, basically what we're saying and what we have seen in the past is that the crack epidemic was concentrated in poor urban areas, which of course, given the history we've already studied, are also largely communities of color. Whereas cocaine was the other form of the drug was used by wealthier, upper class, middle class, white folks. And so the crack epidemic really hit communities of color differently and more seriously than white communities. But yet we had the very unequal punishing of the consumption of cocaine versus crack, when in essence it's the same drug. So many people have argued that the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was it reflected racial bias in the criminal justice system. The other thing to think about it too, 5 grams of crack cocaine is what an addict would have for one use. It would be one use, like 5 grams, right? That's not dealer level possession. And it would be, you know, I don't know how much 5 grams of crack cocaine would cost, but it certainly would be within the reach of an addict who has just scored some money and is then scoring their fix, right? By comparison, 500 grams of powder cocaine, that is half a kilo. We're talking about maybe $8,000 or $9,000 of cocaine, half a brick of cocaine. No way a recreational drug user is going to have $6,000 worth of, and that would be if you bought the kilo, it's in kilos. When you break it down and it's sold retail on the streets, the price goes up, up, up. So basically, no way would a recreational or even an addict who's not trafficking or dealing would have half a kilo of cocaine. And so this discrepancy punishing addicts versus only going after traffickers. And you lay that on the racial dynamics of who was using crack and who was using and abusing cocaine. And we see very clearly institutional racism in the criminal justice system encapsulated in this particular law. Okay, so now let me see here. I just want to see. I kind of wanted to go to see if I could get rid of that circle, but I have a pause here, so we're just going to keep on, and then I'm going to turn you over to a video online, and I'll fix my circles. Okay, so what has been the impact of the 1986 anti-drug abuse law? Well, here you go, mass incarceration. The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Just let that sink in for a minute. We're 5% of the world's population, but 1 in 4 incarcerated people in the world is in the United States. And many people, including myself, argue that this is a product of the war on drugs. The war on drugs, remember, the militarized approach to combat drugs and drug trafficking has been implemented in the United States as well as in Latin America. Today, we're talking about the war on drugs in the United States, which has resulted in mass incarceration, particularly of people of color. In our next lecture, we'll be talking about the impacts of the war on drugs in Latin America. Okay. So some statistics on mass incarceration. What has mass incarceration meant in terms of US spending? Here we have a graph from 2007. States spend more than $44 billion on incarceration and related expenses, a 127% increase from 1987, the year after the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed. Over the same period, spending in higher education rose just 21%. So y'all wondering why our government doesn't have any money to lower tuition costs. Part of the problem is where the money is going, according to many people, including myself. It costs more money to incarcerate a person than to educate them per year. Now, who is being incarcerated? Here's another graph that's really helpful, as it is difficult to watch. Okay, so this is from the ACLU. You have the lecture PowerPoint, so you can also look at these sources and get some more information. 1 in 106 white males is incarcerated today. That number jumps to 136 when we look at Hispanic males. But for African Americans in our country, 1 out of every 15 Black males age 18 or older is incarcerated. And a lot of this is indeed a reflection of the racial discrepancies of the 1986 law. Now, here's another graph that illustrates that booming prison population. Here we have 1986. It's been growing, it's been growing. Well, this is really the beginning of the Nixon's war on drugs, other dynamics. The war on crime is going to happen around this time as well, 1980s, 1990s. But look at the boom in the US state and federal prison population from 1925 to 2014. Mass incarceration, part of the war on drugs. Another dynamic, relatedly, that led to mass incarceration of African American and Hispanic laws were the war on crime policies, another discourse, the war on crime. This starts in the 1980s. It's continued by Clinton in the 1990s. But in places like Los Angeles, California, large cities across the country, Chicago, New York, there were gang injunctions that were passed by governments, city governments, that basically allowed police officers to stop and frisk any suspected gang members as part of a gang injunction. So what does that mean? It means in densely populated urban areas in large cities across the United States, that if a police officer found young African-American men gathered somewhere, or a Hispanic young man in particular who was dressed in a particular way, a white tank top, maybe some dicky khaki pants, that in and of itself, oh, and of course not just loitering, but cruising the Ave, right? If a cop saw a car go up and down, the part of the gang injunction was there was no cruising the Ave. And so police could stop for any of these reasons, stop and frisk these young people. And if any of those young people happen to have a small amount of marijuana or a small amount of crack cocaine on them, well, then it was a mandatory minimum sentence. Check this out. I forgot to give you this detail here. Mandatory, no, I got it. Mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years without parole for possession, small scale possession. And stop and frisk as part of gang injunction meant that more young people than ever before were being put into contact with law enforcement. And of course, there enters in another element of racial bias, right? Gang injunctions allow stop and frisk for young people of color living in urban areas, but yet in the suburbs that are predominantly white, we know that drug consumption of marijuana and cocaine and other substances are at similar levels. But who is stopping and frisking young white folks in the suburbs, right? So that's how that law produced those large numbers of mass incarcerated people along racial lines. Okay. All right, so next what we're going to do, I'm going to introduce to you the great work of the Global Commission on Drugs. This is a film that they produced, Break the Taboo. But I'm not going to ask you to watch the film. I just want you to watch the trailer. You can copy and paste the link from the lecture itself. I'll also make sure that it's in the folder, or really simply you can just Google Break the Taboo and just watch the trailer. I don't think that the entire film is available for you right now. So, okay, so I'm going to end the first half of this lecture. I also just want to make sure that the video is not too long and I can download it and upload it and deal with all of those things. So come back to watch part 2 of the lecture for the war on drugs for today after you have watched that quick 3-minute video of Break the Taboo, and get ready to write down some statistics that you'll hear that might surprise you. We'll see you in a few minutes.